Thank you to all of us for joining us for a second webinar on personalized learning. I'm your host, Darren Phillips, and welcome to all of you who are joining us from around the world. My honor is to be part of this webinar series and bring you the content the teacher's voice around the world has asked for. I'm delighted tonight to host a conversation today with two people who have done much work in this field of personalized learning, Allison Zmuda and Kate Bean. If you tuned into our webinar last time, we spent time exploring the rationale of personalized learning. We made some definitions about what it was, we shared some experience of what it looks like, and we explored this with some great questions from the audience. We encourage you, of course, in the webinar to ask questions, so if you wish to do so, please log into the Crowdcast and ask your questions from there. Today in our second webinar series, we're going to go a little deeper into the personalized learning and talk a little bit about clarity. Allison has framed this conversation for us and the remaining three webinars around the 4 C's from the student point of view. We'll start today with a conversation about clarity, which serves as the North Star that helps students focus on task purpose and how it relates to the broader aims of schooling. The contemporary challenge is not the quality of the standards, but how we have to leverage those standards to create meaningful, personalized learning experiences for the student. In the following webinar, we'll shift to the context, an underlying shift needed to take towards the co-creation, and an opportunity for students to work with educators as learning partners to have an increased stake in the what and the how of schooling. The fourth in the series will explore culture. What are the tenets of this learning environment of personalized learning that move teachers from partnering with students, or move to partnering with students to jointly create a safe and respectful environment where deep thinking is expected, messy, and out in the open? And we'll culminate with capital. How do we collectively improve this performance, and talk more about how do we invest in ourselves to grow? So even after today, there's much to discuss. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two esteemed guests who are here to enlighten, and if our seminar or our webinar from the last time was any indication, to also entertain us. As you know, many of you will know Allison. She's a renowned author and thought leader in education today. As an educational consultant, Allison works with educators to grow ideas on how to make learning for students challenging, possible, and worthy of the attempt. Allison has written several books, including this most recent, entitled Learning Personalized: The Evolution for a Contemporary Classroom. And it's in this book where Allison discusses Avison Charter School's personalized mastery learning models and plans, which leads me to introduce our second presenter, Kate Bean. Kate is the founder and executive director of Avison Charter Schools, which in one of the few public U.S. schools is focused on personalized mastery learning for grades K to 12. It was during her work with No Child Left Behind that Kate met the team of educational professionals that would later join her to establish Avison Charter Schools and introduce a new personalized mastery learning and teaching model for education. So, very warm welcome to both of you. Great to be in the same time zone as you this time. And of course, as always, I like to start off with a kickoff question, so I just want to make sure you're both there. Welcome, and good evening to both of you.
Good evening.
Good evening, Darren.
And I know, Allison, we've taken you away from a child's birthday, or just finished out that, so thanks very much for joining with us.
My great pleasure.
So I've just got a bit of a slide up on the screen, because you know that I always do this, try and turn this into more of a casual chat than just a head-speaking session. So I want to warm you up and turn it back into that coffee chat, although it's a little later on in the afternoon. I love this quote from Lessing that says, "For me, the greatest beauty always lies in the greatest clarity." I've got some other quotes in this space, but I'm going to put this as your warm-up question for you, Allison, if that's okay.
Yeah.
What personally gets you clarity?
Wow. Well, are you talking about a learning environment or a learning space?
No, for you personally.
Yeah. So, right now I'm starting to write another book with Ben Akalik around the connection between personalized learning and habits of mind. And part of gaining clarity is really being engaged in a deep dive and an exploration filled with conversations and research, but sort of stepping back and getting that bird's eye view. So try to zoom in to the trees and play in that space for a while, and then zoom out to say, what am I truly trying to accomplish in regards to this? So that's what helps me when I'm engaged in a writing project.
That's fantastic. That's a great way of getting clarity. I've got another quote for you that's a little bit more morbid, I guess. David Allen made this quote about, "There's nothing like the fear of imminent death that gives us absolute clarity." So it's your turn, Kate. Not making this. It's your turn.
I don't want
What gives you clarity?
Well, the irony is, right, and starting two charter schools, my staff and our team would say there was no clarity when we started. Mm-hmm. I said, hey, let's all do personalized learning. It seems like the right thing to do. Ready? Go. And so I think it's been an 8-year process for us. So I think what gives me clarity now is trial and error. And we kind of failed fast and we failed often. But through that process, we finally came to, the idea of personalized mastery learning, putting those two words together so that it's very clear to us that it is personalized. We need to be very conscious of the students' passions and interests. At the same time, they're working towards mastery of something. So it didn't seem too loosey-goosey, which sometimes people can associate personalized learning with kind of a free choice. Let's do whatever we want to do, which is not that at all. And that's what we're going to discuss today in this webinar. So I think the clarity, for me, I continue to push in new ideas, and that's my role as the visionary of the school. And it's the clarity is now a fantastic staff who says, all right, I hear that idea. Let's put it in perspective with what we are doing and what the data has told us works for kids. So I have to say, it's my staff keeps me clear. It's not my propensity to be clear, but they keep me clear by challenging me to put my ideas into a working model and then watch the data to see if it works.
Yeah, and Kate, I mean, what you said is absolutely lovely. I think the notion of being engaged in messy, it means that you have to fail and fail often. That's part of what messy looks like. I think what we're going to talk about in this webinar is thinking about clarity as the North Star. So from a learning experience point of view, from a messy point of view, we do need to continue to give students what is it that you're aiming for, and how can you use clarity of that aim to give you solace, but also to give you direction when you feel lost, stuck, frustrated, etc.
Correct. And I think my teachers were the guinea pigs, and as they started to get clarity, now we feel like we can provide it for our students, and we'll show some examples of that this evening.
Well, I love how you guys leaped already at my beginning, and you're just chomping at the bit to jump right into that. And thank you so much for introducing that so well. You've just kind of taken the lead. So let me just provoke you a little bit further to say, in the last webinar, and I guess I'll direct this to you, Allison, that we talked at length, I guess, about the vision, the rationale. What I'd really like to understand is, knowing that that's your vision of personal, how does this line up with this idea of clarity? Because we saw a little bit of that last time in the questions that came from our audience. In personalized learning, what do I need to do as a teacher to cover? What am I responsible for?
So I want to say first and foremost that personalized learning and many of the state, provincial, and national standards go hand in hand. They're not incompatible with one another. But at the same time, when you're thinking about goal clarity, standards need to be drafted in such a way that they are accessible from a teacher point of view and from a student point of view, so that they can understand what is that language saying, and based on that, what is my responsibility, what's my charge to do. So when it comes to covering the curriculum, I would suggest that the long-term transfer goals, those broader goals that we're trying to aim for as part of a subject area or part of a course level are really defined first and foremost. And then when I'm moving through topics and or units from one to another, I keep in mind exactly what it is that I'm aiming for. So that creates a level of sanity for a classroom teacher, but that also does create a level of accomplishment from a teacher's point of view, that they are doing things in alignment to the standards.
Thanks for that, Allison. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess I'm connecting to that on an academic level, but I'm going to redirect this to Kate, if that's okay. So what does that look like in practice? What do these key goals, the outcomes? What would I really look at? I understand the idea of aligning that with the standards, but how is that done? That sounds awfully messy.
Well, I think I just want to piggyback on what Allison was talking about. At no time, even when I did my intro to this webinar, when I talked about it was messy and we failed to pass and fail often, at no time did we ever think we didn't need to stick to the state, at that time when we opened the school, state standards, now Common Core standards that have been adopted, because we're located in California and that's our mandate. And so you always start with that as your core set of whatever it is, state standards, Common Core. So we always started there, but also piggybacking on what Allison said, we had to take those and make them accessible. So by taking a Common Core standard and then rewriting it to a certain extent, we don't want to lose the vision and the initial, the original intent of the writers of those standards, but we do need to make it accessible. For us, in a pragmatic way, it looks like starting some of those with literally I can statements, and we call them learning outcomes, because the idea of saying Common Core standards to kids didn't really resonate, but the idea of saying we've taken the Common Core standards and we've turned them into learning outcomes. Those learning outcomes start with I can, and I think, Darren, you probably have, I might flip you to not a couple of slides in, if you can show just one more. So if you're looking at how we look, so that just gives us an example of an I can or learning outcome in what we call foundational outcomes. So in this example of argumentative writing, the student is literally, we've written these in a way the student can read it, understand it, and have a real clear idea of what the advisor is asking them to do, but more importantly, what we've agreed upon together. The advisor or the teacher, I'll use teacher, we say advisor at Avison, but the teacher and the student are working together to read this outcome, and then how the outcome breaks down to give them a real clear vision of where we're going to end up eventually. We may take this child may take a different path on how to do it. They may get there at a different time, the when, but the fact that they're getting to the same place of proficiency and what we call mastery is clear between the teacher and the student.
That's fantastic. Again, that looks like pretty amazing work. Maybe I could ask you this, Allison. How do you get there? How do you do this?
Yeah, I think this is a pretty daunting endeavor. A fair number of teachers have been engaged in this exercise before. So I think the starting of this is pretty tough to get folks excited about. But I think from an intellectual point of view, from an emotional point of view, you understand the impact if you have a clear goal, if you have your sights set on something. And it's very frustrating to have your sights set on something that you can't make sense of. You can't figure it out because the language isn't clear enough yet. So again, I know lots of teachers understand and appreciate that there is a level of obtuseness and density in many of the standards language. But I think at the same time, and again, Kate's indicating this when she's talking about her framing it in I can statements and outcome statements. We want to make sure that it is something that the kids believe is worth attaining. So I think that's the second piece, is that kids have to have a reason why to care about it, why to engage in it in the first place. So it's not just identifying those goals, but it's also describing those goals in a way that's this natural through line between what's happening inside of school and what's happening outside of school.
Yeah, and if I could jump in, Darren, if you could go back one slide, I think what else, when she's saying it's that buy-in, right? So when you go, if you go back one slide, Darren, so we use the learning board in this way and this is, when you log right on, you're seeing immediately with this visual representation of this child with these areas within an ELA. Well, I love that it's a 6th grade class and this kid looks like he's 5, but he's a prodigy. Let's call him a prodigy. He's in 6th grade. This is our little demo student. This is actually not one of our students. But so the idea, though, is the student is at the center. Like literally visually you can see, right? The student is at the center. You can see that it's equally important what I understand I need to do and how I'm going to get there,
right.
when I'm going to get there, as it is for the teacher to understand what I need to learn, how I'm going to learn it, and when am I going to get there. So this visual, so when our students log on to the learning board, when our teacher advisors log on, when parents log on, they're going to see that we literally mean this is all about the student. So as Allison was saying, you have to make it accessible for a student. And the way you make it accessible is through language that seems clear, not simple, not dumbing down, not just very clear and concise.
Yep.
And do what you need to do to help break down that often obtuse, Common Core standard or state standard into parts that are very workable for a student depending on the age.
Yep.
And so I think this is just a great visual that just tells everybody in our learning community that the child is the most important person in understanding what they're learning, how they're going to learn it, and when they're going to learn it.
One of the things that I suggest is that there is a difference between simple and simplistic. Simple is, it can be clean, it can be elegant, but still in language that a 5 or a 6-year-old can understand. Yes. Simplistic is really dumbing it down in a way that is disrespectful to that particular child or developmentally inappropriate to that child. And again, it's a fine balancing act that does require, and as Kate can attest, and I'm sure many of the districts that I work with that I facilitate can attest as well, it requires a level of meticulousness, paying attention to what the standards suggest, but also paying attention to your broader vision of what our school is trying to do for students on behalf of that larger community. So the standards are not the full breadth of what the long-term goals are. Those long-term goals can also be influenced by the community that you serve, by the vision that you have, and by the pedagogy that you have as well.
That's great. We're getting quite a few audience questions in that. I'm going to tie this in because I'm a bit curious as well. And I know we've had a little bit of conversation in setting up some of these slides. Kate, some of the questions are, what is the learning board? How did you do that? But I think this is the germane question that maybe you could tie this in, is that how much of the learning transfer goals, the learning outcome developments happens without teachers. So a lot of this obviously is in student language. So can you just expand on that a little bit?
Sure, thanks. I think I want to jump back to what Allison was talking about, that the Common Core standards and the state standards aren't the end game. They're a piece of a puzzle. A student is developing, they're relying on us as adults to help them create their entire learning network. And the Common Core standards and the state standards are a piece of that. Mm-hmm. There are also many other things that kids, need to learn, and as adults we do know that they need to learn that haven't been captured in academic standards. So of course you're going to find all kinds of, we've often had learning outcomes around self-efficacy and learning outcomes around social-emotional development. And so I want to encourage folks not to confine themselves to those. Now, people can get a little nervous when they start heading into different areas of outcomes, but I think as long as a community you're working on it with other adults in the building or the school, I think you can't go wrong. Now, when it comes to the students participating in that, what we have found is that the foundational outcomes are pretty straightforward. We don't find, so we have two types of outcomes, learning outcomes. One are the foundational outcomes, and maybe it would help if you also went, Darren, to a slide that shows some of the foundational outcomes. Yeah, so there's one on that's on the learning board, and then I think if you go to the next slide, you'll actually see some of our ELA foundational and interest outcomes. So as you can see here, these are pretty straightforward. This is for the expert in the room. And remember, with personalized learning, we're never handing over the learning process completely to a student. The expert in the room is saying, these are the things that, you know, I need you to master at the end of, you know, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9, 10, 11, 12. Foundational or foundational, these are the things that we would all agree on, are enduring understandings, enduring you know, skills that we need kids to say, yes, I've done that, I've shown proficiency. The second piece, though, are so kids don't have a lot of input on what these are. Now, they will have input on how they're going to show mastery and when they'll show mastery, but not on the outcomes themselves. But we realized as a school that doesn't allow for enough personalization. So we have developed now interest outcomes. Well, I shouldn't say we, because this is where it becomes now a completely collaborative effort. There's going to be interest outcomes that students are going to work with their teacher advisor to create. So they're going to create their own I can statements in the areas of science or technology or health or entrepreneurship or art. And I don't know if you'll be able to scroll down. So here we go. So you're going to see arts and STEM and civics. So we've given them some examples because, again, we're like, hey, student, create your own outcome and let them go. No, that's not what personalized mastery learning would be. You would want to make sure, here's some examples of ones. These are pretty generic as far as developing driving questions around your area of focus, and then a lot of project-based work will be connected to the interest outcomes. But I think this is the perfect place to develop these together, the teacher and the student developing interest outcomes. And then using those interest outcomes as being, I don't want to say just as important. I don't know, Allison, maybe you and I could debate this a little, because I'd like support on this. Like, are interest outcomes equally important to foundational? These are all questions we still have that is still very messy. And we're in that right now. We're in that whole conversation.
Can I just, and I'll get Allison to answer this, and thank you very much, Matt and Brenda, for forwarding those questions in. Hopefully we're answering those in the webinar here, but I've got one here from Kalina Clark, who makes this comment, Allison, that how you're connecting personalized learning with the habits of mind. You know, the habits of mind, how you're looking at these interest outcomes, how does that all tie together? And how does that connection happen, and how does that work?
So when you're thinking about a connection between the long-term goals and habits of mind, we could start taking a look at problem solving. And one of the long-term goals I would suggest, and again I think Kate would agree with this as well, is that students are able to dig deep, and again I'm sort of brainstorming this off the cuff, but they can dig deep into a problem, a challenge, or a topic that they feel connected to, that they feel that's incredibly important, and then pose an investigation, pose a thesis statement to pursue through action, through a science lab, through any kind of political demonstration. That's the way, and again, I'm going to go back to what Kate was suggesting, that's the way that I see those two pieces connecting. You have these very broad, long-term, subject-based, foundational, if you choose to call them that, Kate, foundational goals. Like, here's another example, and this is going to be on a set of materials that you'll get after the webinar. So for history or social studies, one long-term goal is using knowledge of historical, geographic, and economic patterns to better understand the present and prepare for the future. Under that umbrella, you can start to see, from an interest-based point of view, I can pursue that thinking about race relations in modern-day America right now. Because if I want to find out more information about that, I can start looking at demographics and the movement of people throughout a period of time. I can think about the Syrian refugee crisis through that lens. Any kind of interest outcome still is in service to a broad foundational outcome that, again, can be grounded in a subject area, a discipline, or it can be grounded in cross-disciplinary goals like collaboration or creative thinking.
Yeah, and I like what Allison's saying. You know, we've chosen to literally call them foundational and interest. I don't think that's up. I don't think everybody would have to do that. I think what Allison's saying is you take a foundational, or how we say foundational. Let's just say you take your standard that you know that kids need to learn, like the example that she gave, and then finding their interest, their area of passion, their angle that they want to attack that. Developing good, we say driving questions, whether you say an investigation, an inquiry, whatever that is. So all this terminology, I don't want people on the webinar, to think we're proposing there's just this one way to do it. But the passion behind, for me, personalized learning is that every educator is looking at, let's make sure my kids are really clear on what they have to show proficiency on, and then let me involve them. Right? Let me involve them in those other pieces of taking their passion, their interest, their life experience, whatever it is, to be a partner in that, right? To be a partner in their learning. So I definitely don't want people to feel like, wow, it has to look like separate interest outcomes and foundational, because it doesn't have to be that. That's just something we've chosen to pilot to see if that gave us clarity as a school on making sure we were doing it and the kids understood this, and so we broke it down into those two categories.
And that's why we're connecting this to the 4 C's for the rest of the webinar series, is that doesn't matter what language we use, we can all agree that first we need to have goal clarity. What is it that we're aiming for? And then second, how do we design as partners or co-creators, or perhaps a totally student-driven experience? How do we support that student in service to the demonstration of that goal clarity? So in Kate's school, they call it personalized learning mastery, right?
Personalized mastery learning.
Personalized mastery learning, thank you. So they call it personalized mastery learning. But in another school, they may call it something else. The vocabulary is not as important as those major design elements. You cannot design effectively if you have no idea what the end in mind is. Now, again, keep in mind, we've also said from the very beginning that personalized learning is something that continues to be novel, that requires fresh thinking, and we make mistakes as part of our action plan. And that kind of messiness that we're demonstrating as part of the initiative in personalized learning, but that's also something that we're expecting to see students being engaged in, and teacher and students interactions being engaged in that messiness as well. So we don't have this as sort of a recipe or a series of steps where if you do this, this, and this, bam, you'll have personalized learning happen. But you do need to start somewhere, and the very important first step is figuring out what goal clarity is, even if you need to continue to fine-tune the language in order to do that.
So I'm going to jump on a question that's being presented, maybe combine a couple together because they seem to be along the same vein. Just to follow up on what you're saying, Allison, is how do you plan for personalized learning and really make sure that we address these goals? There seems to be so little time, I guess, and do we have to work that in, the time factors into part of the goals that we have? How do we make sure that we have everything put in place? Sounds like an interesting process. Can you talk us through the process of what we should be doing to try and plan for and document these, or the process that you went through? So I'll probably ask and follow through with Kate and say, how did they do that? Because it looks like there's lots of curiosity about how that's been done.
That's right. I mean, so I'm going to be classic understanding by design here right now. And again, it's about goal clarity. You have to understand what it is that you're aiming for. That's part of identifying the desired results. In personalized learning, you do it in a way that's not perhaps as formalized. There are certain skills that are perhaps more important than others for a given unit or a given period of time, to focus on a topic or a theme. But at the same time, there is a level of flexibility in terms of what is more important or less important given what students want to pursue. So I think you can't design a full-fledged understanding by design unit if you're familiar with the EBD model. You can't design that fully yet because that too will become personalized. The parts that are generally not personalized are the transfer goals that are the driving force, that are the connector from unit to unit and course to course and program. So in the webinar series on culture, we will talk about more of the day-to-day instructional planning. But the clarity moment, the bird's eye view, we want to zoom all the way back and ask the question, what is it that we're aiming for? So I appreciate that question. So from an instructional point of view, we'll talk about that in a webinar a few weeks down the road. But from a big picture point of view, if you don't have that goal clarity, I think you're going to be spinning your wheels a little bit until you solidify that.
I'm just going to add in here Brenda's comment. That's the big question. How do you plan for this? So how do you plan for this, Kate? How have you done this?
Well, that's an open-ended question. So I think when we talk about, I think it's back to, again, trust. So I bet there are a lot of people on this webinar, or if this was a huge webinar and we had 1,000 teachers online, many people, probably the majority, would be saying, yes, so how do I manage my time to do it? And we are going to get, further down the line, we're going to talk more about the pedagogy and how to do it. But I think most teachers get caught up on, but this is what I have to teach. And what I'm asking them to do is what we used to do. We used to have more freedom to do, but I hope it's coming back. And part of this, what Allison would like to see, is that educators are trusted more to say, yes, trust me to know, my children that are sitting in front of me, trust me to know that I can take this Common Core standard or the state standard and I can put it in language and an understanding that my kids can understand, that they'll be able to not only understand but be motivated to actually participate in the learning process. And so the idea of planning for it, it's hard to say how to do it because you know your kids. You look out at your sea of kids, whether you see 26 or 30 a day in a self-contained classroom or you're seeing several kids come through a block of physics period by period, you're the one that know your kids, and to trust that you're going to say, I'm going to take these outcomes and I think or these standards, and I need to make them clear for my kids, there's not a simple solution to that. But know that there are groups of some kids who may be passionate about something. So it's not, when we say personalization, that still can look like some small group instruction. It can look like cooperative learning. It can look like a lot of things, but you have to trust, I probably have said this too many times, but you really have to trust that you know what to do as the educator in the class to make it accessible, to make it clear to the students of where you would like to get to. But as soon as you've got the kids on board with you, it becomes a much easier way to do it. So the planning isn't so much sitting on Sunday night getting ready for the week. Planning is much more nimble and flexible because you kind of have to watch where the kids are going, listen carefully to what they're saying and how they're interested, and where did you catch them? Boy, I just caught them on that. Then I better run with that for today because they are interested right now. And when I say they, maybe it's a small group or maybe it's 1 or 2 kids. Yeah, again, messy, and it's probably not the answer that everybody wants, but I'll let Allison kind of, she says everything I say but better.
Well, I mean, I want to echo what Kate said. It's really about trusting the teacher, right? And so we're moving, hopefully, the pendulum is going to start shifting in a different direction now, where we trust the teacher that's working with a student or a range of students in the classroom in front of them. But at the same time, this is not a longing for the good old days when we didn't have standardized assessments. I would actually suggest that this requires a significant amount of shifts in the role of the teacher and the role of the student. And I think part of that shift, again, is grounded in not just individual trust, but collaborative trust in the teaching enterprise, right? So we'll talk about, on our last webinar series, we'll talk about capital. How do we invest and grow all of us as learners, so that we can continue to make sure that what's happening in our classrooms is growing every single one of us. So again, it's not just the individual teachers on Sunday nights trying to take their state frameworks and writing a long-term goal. We actually think that this is the best thing to do as part of a vertical alignment team, not just to articulate the long-term goals, but to really think hard about what are the range of performances that students could be inspired by. And so that's going to be where we talk about next in our webinar series. It's really grounded in context. How do we have students come to the table with us to co-create these learning experiences? How do we have them develop interest outcomes? And how do we sustain them in their drive to tackle an ambitious, messy project that requires a fair bit of dead ends, reworks, revisions, etc.?
And
Great.
know, I have to say something, and know that that process itself brings many rewards to students. Just the process itself, even being messy, brings a lot of rewards to the student in their ability to navigate messiness, to navigate all of that. And so, but that's, Allison's right. We've got to get collectively, the educational community has to be okay with that, and we hope we're turning the corner on the pendulum swing. How many metaphors did I put in there? But we, that we've got it's not, page by page to the same group at the same time of, all the kids. We have to get away from that. And when I hearken back to the good old days, what I meant is we need to have that autonomy, but with now new, clear understandings of what it means to have clear goals and clear outcomes. But do it in a way that's flexible and nimble. And I'd say, as far as the planning, that's where you have to start looking. You're more of a resource planner, if I'm really going to answer that question. You're more of a resource planner than you are a lesson planner when you're doing personalized learning. You're finding multiple resources that the kids can have. A resource of space in the classroom, the resource of time with your period, or your block of time that you have them, the resource of adults or experts who can help out, your resource of technology skills. All of the, so you become a resource manager when you're doing personalized learning.
That's right. And you know what? Kate has the tweetable moment of the webinar, because I think she's saying it spot on. We are not planning daily instruction the way we used to do back in the day. This is a new shift that requires us to be more flexible and adaptive than ever before, because software platforms can teach rote skills and design standardized assessments better than we can. But what we can do is honor the students right in front of us and have them gain feedback and experience through their own creative process.
Great.
You can talk now, Darren. We're going to let you talk.
Well, I'm just going to be mindful of time and add in some of our audience questions. We've got about 5 more minutes, really, for audience questions. I'm going to ask this one, and would encourage any others to come through. We'll probably have time for 1 or 2 questions. The question that's come through is, how do you develop the disciplined mindset to really have this goal setting to be clear and give the freedom that you're talking about?
One of the things that I've found incredibly helpful is posing the question, who wants to inherit a better student? And I think a fair number of folks can raise their hands and say, me, I want to have that student. I want a student. I was working with a math group in Western Virginia the other day, and they said, all we want are kids that can figure out a messy problem. Somebody that can try a new strategy, can figure out whether it's working or it's not working. And yes, we care about the computation, but that's not the point of engaging in a rigorous math problem. The point is to really trying to figure something out based on what they know and figuring out what they don't know and then taking a course of action. So that's the kind of disciplined mindset that we're advocating for, and that can be grown as early as our youngest students in pre-K and kindergarten and sustained all the way through 12th grade. So that's the part of a disciplined mindset, articulating those handful of long-term goals that anchor the kind of design and development that we're doing with our students.
Yeah, and I think for us, when we talked about the personalized mastery learning mindset, we kind of define it as a person, and that could be a student or an adult, who can thrive in a social or personal learning environment. So we're trying to create kids that no matter where they go into, a personal learning environment or a social learning environment, which is really what we do all day long in our careers and in school. You're going from personally learning individually to social learning, in a meeting, out of a meeting, back to your cube, whatever it is, that they should be able to thrive. So the skills of thriving in those two learning environments are exactly what we're talking about with personalized learning. Kids to understand how they learn best, when do they learn best, at what rate do they learn best, how do I find adults to be in my learning network, how do I find other students to be in my learning network. Those things, I think anybody who wants to change their mindset as an educator would say, of course, that's what our kids should be walking away with.
Yep.
That's your first step to saying, okay, let's get messy.
And I think we had an earlier question on the connection between personalized learning and habits of mind. I think habits of mind are really the pedagogical anchor of personalized learning. We want kids that can, and adults that listen with understanding and empathy. We want kids that can create and innovate and imagine. Those are 2 of the 16 habits of mind. And so, like I said, when we're moving into that cultural space, we'll talk about that in that webinar series.
Well, we've got lots of questions from our audience, and a lot of them relate to our next upcoming sessions as well. I've got one more I think that we have time for, and then maybe some quick closing remarks. Does this level of personalization and the goals and outcome statements that you showed earlier, Kate, does that increase or does it change with the age of the students? Does the age make a difference in terms of how they can connect to those topics of interest, the goals, in a different way than with younger students?
It does, yeah, of course. Developmentally, we're looking at those in a different way. And it depends on the content area, too, whereas English language arts are very cyclical. I mean, kids learn things and they kind of, when you look at our the piece that we showed on the screen with all the learning outcomes, they read very similarly based on the grade level, because what you're doing with English language arts is taking a skill, but you're applying it to more complex text, or a higher level of primary documents or things like that. So it just depends. So this process does look different depending on the content, depending on the grade level and the age of the student. But the processes are the same. So the idea of knowing the kids in front of you, saying how are we going to make these learning outcomes as clear as possible and engage them in the process. So the process is the same. It's just, but yes, they would look different, of course, across the board. But again, we're still anchoring them in those Common Core standards, state standards, and then other, as I love what Allison said before, the other things that are important to us as a culture, our school culture, our community culture, creating those interest outcomes that can also be part of that. So it all comes back to knowing who's in front of you and getting them clear on what they're going to do. Now say that better, Allison.
Well, I mean,
I talk and then she puts it into a very nice, succinct package.
Well, and I'm thinking about an example for engineering, right? So an engineering long-term goal is to define a need or a problem and develop a solution. I think 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds can start playing around with that idea already. And so sometimes we may make it too fine-grained in regards to thinking about really what the big picture is. So, I mean, I would suggest that's one of the big picture goals of engineering, right? That's the whole enchilada. Again, we do that through an increased sophistication and skill set, right? And that sophistication and skill set can be part of how we're measuring student learning through the range of solutions they've come up with across the years. But at the end of the day, it can be that simple when it comes to these long-term goals.
Fantastic. I know we could talk with you guys all day, and we will. We've got other 3 times to talk. I think this has been fantastic, and I think the takeaways about being clear about the process, we've really explored that question about clarity and what are we aiming for, and what it takes to clarify these outcomes for personalized learning for students. I think you've done a great job today, and I think it's been fantastic with having both of you. And especially, it's been great that you've really identified and connected with a lot of our audience in terms of how this process fits with the standards that they're delivering to. So thank you very much for that. Is there any closing remarks you want to throw in there, or maybe even a better answer to my opening question, Allison, before we close?
A better answer? I don't know.
That makes it sound like it wasn't good in the first place.
I mean, I want to sort of close with 2 things that I probably have said already. Number 1, standards and personalized learning can go hand in hand. One doesn't preclude the other. So I think that's something that I want to continue to emphasize. And secondly, it's important to get goal clarity before you're designing or planning anything. And again, I know that we're thinking about trying to plan for the next day, let alone think about, wait a minute, what's the big picture, what am I aiming for? So again, it's a process in the articulation, but at the same time, it's a worthy process that, yes, it takes time, yes, it takes refinement, but it's a collective enterprise that we're doing, as opposed to one individual teacher being in this position doing this for all of their kids.
Yeah, and I'll just use that as a jumping off place. And I don't think I really answered the question before about the learning board and how we use that. But I would say what Allison just said, once you have that goal clarity as adults, now when you take it to the students, provide any kind of real strong visual for the students to see what they're constantly aiming for. Yes, we use the learning board, which is a great tool. And that the EduTech has provided us, but I think that can be done in a lot of different ways. Give a visual representation of the goal itself, the learning outcome, whatever you want to call it, that it's clear to the students, it's clear to parents too, and we didn't really touch upon that much, but really clear to parents of where we're heading down the road. Because when they're clear, especially parents, there's a lot more trust on their end too. Because if you can be really clear on goals, then they're going to leave it up to your professional discretion on how to get their kids there, and that you'll let them know when the student has gotten there. But if they don't know where you're headed, they're going to be a little uneasy with this idea of personalization and what do you mean. So I think it's extremely important to have some kind of visual representation, so that you can always refer back to and keep everybody on the same page of where we're heading, even though it will be messy. How many times did we say messy today? That probably scared everybody off. They probably dropped the calls by now.
Well, I do want to share with you, and thank you both on behalf of our entire audience. And no, we don't have thousands. We certainly have hundreds of attendees that are certainly been very active in asking us questions. Thank you so much, Kate and Allison, for your time. Looking forward to doing this again. And thank you, the audience, for your fantastic questions. Please, don't worry if we didn't get to your questions. We'll coordinate with Kate and Allison. We'll have them addressed in the following webinars. Certainly around context is going to be exciting because there's a lot of your questions do relate to those. So the next webinar in this series is the 14th of October. For those of you that are following along in Australia that you already experienced tomorrow, that would be the 15th of October. And we're going to be focusing on context. Why should I care? In this session, we'll focus on the design of assignments that are worth the investments of students. These meaningful tasks are born out of authentically messy problems, which we've said a lot today, and the challenges and experience where the students has an integral role in the development and demonstration. We'll share some concrete examples of tasks as well as where you can look for some inspiration to get you started. So I'm hoping that you'll tune in again. Again, thank you to our presenters, and thank you for your time today. It's been just a joy doing this with you, and looking forward to the next couple of sessions. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.